Welcome to this voyage through one of the most horrifying stories ever to cross the obscure records. This is a narrative that defies explanation and remains veiled in shadows. Prepare yourselves, because what you are about to hear will rock your certainties about what is possible. This film was made only for amusement and is a work of fiction. Any resemblance to genuine persons, alive or dead, is totally coincidental. The year was 1879, and Tennessee was living under the weight of a smothering heat that seemed to suck all life from the hills. In that mountainous region where trees grew twisted and night winds carried ancient whispers, stood a building that everyone knew, but few dared to speak, the Blackwood house. Its word alone was enough to make workmen look away, and women make the sign of the cross even in broad daylight. It was not simply a house, it was a presence. Surrounded by thick forests, the property stood alone atop a steep hill where sunlight seldom ever touched the ground. The mansion's windows appeared to be vacant eyes observing everybody who came near. It was said that the structure had been built on territory no one should have touched, a spot where the earth itself seemed to deny life. The surrounding trees became twisted with branches that stretched at inconceivable angles as if trying to escape something buried deep beneath. The family there lived in total seclusion. They were silent individuals who only came in the city when absolutely required, always with distant gazes and black garments that appeared to take in the light. The closest neighbors who lived miles away reported unusual sounds during the night. They weren't yells or music. They were unique, causing the animals on the fences to stir and the blood to flow cold. The tall, slender father of the family had deep-set eyes that seemed to see right through others. He rarely talked, and when he did, his voice had an equine timbre that made the words sound like stones being dragged across metal. Nobody was certain of his identity, doing in that large house. But carts packed with huge containers climbed the dirt road on moonless nights, driven by hooded men who never returned welcomes. The wife was even more fascinating, a pale woman who seemed to float when she walked, her steps making no sound on the wooden floorboards. She wore long black velvet dresses, even in the height of summer, and always had a veil half covering her face. Those unfortunate enough to encounter her gaze reported there was something deeply wrong in those eyes. It wasn't particularly malevolent, it was emptiness, as though there was simply an unending chasm and no soul at all behind that expression. The employees who worked at Blackwood House seldom lasted long. Some stayed only a few days before disappearing in the middle of the night, leaving behind their belongings and unpaid earnings. The handful who spoke before departing recounted impossible phenomena: doors that opened into rooms that shouldn't exist, corridors that changed position from one day to the next, shadows that moved on their own on the walls, taking on forms that nothing in the space could create. There was a room on the third floor that remained locked at all times. The black oak door was so dark that it appeared to absorb the light from the candle. No one was allowed to approach it, not even the servants, who cleaned the rest of the mansion. But on certain nights, a greenish light escaped from behind that door, filling the corridor with a sickly glow that made anyone who saw it feel instantly nauseous, and along with the light came the sounds. Scratches on the walls, dragging footsteps, and something that resembled deep, heavy breathing, as if something gigantic were on the other side, waiting. The Blackwood house had a complicated connection with the closest town, which was tucked away in the valley below. On one hand, everyone recognized there was something extremely uncomfortable about the area. On the other, the family brought money to the region. They bought supplies in bulk, hired services, and considerably bolstered the local economy. So, folks did what they normally do when confronted by the unexplained. They looked the other way. They whispered, but they never acted. The village blacksmith, a large, strong guy who feared nothing in the visible world, refused to climb up to the home. In response to an inquiry, he merely shook his head and stated that iron provided absolutely no protection in some areas. The church priest, ordinarily so eager in delivering the divine word to the most remote areas, had never set foot on the Blackwood property. He said his prayers died on his lips whenever he stared at that rocky elevation. The seasons passed, but Blackwood House seemed to exist outside of usual hours. While neighboring homes exhibited evidence of wear and tear from the rain and snow, that structure remained unscathed. The paint never peeled. The wood never deteriorated. It was as if natural decay itself shunned that location, knowing that something far worse than mere degeneration already lurked there. And then, on an especially gloomy October evening, when dense clouds obscured the moon and the air was so, something altered, the quality that comes before major storms. The valley's residents awoke to complete quiet emanating from the mansion. Instead of the typical odd noises, there was a deep quiet that appeared to absorb all sound. Not even the crickets were chirping anymore. Even the wind has ceased to blow, and in that impossible silence, everyone knew that something horrible was about to happen. The hush that blanketed the valley that October night was simply the beginning of a chain of events that no one could explain. Blackwood House, always cloaked in mystery, suddenly seemed to throb with a strange energy. The air had changed, as though an imperceptible barrier had been breached. Over the following days, the residents of the region began to notice tiny changes. The birds avoided flying over the property, making wide detours even when it meant adding kilometers to their migratory routes. Regardless of the rider's level of experience, the horses would bulge kilome away and refuse to advance. There was something there that, long before humans became aware of it, the animals sensed it. The Blackwood family, who had always been reticent, grew much more withdrawn. The occasional trip to town completely stopped. The carriages that once traveled up the road at night stopped coming. It was as if the mansion had totally walled itself off from the outer world, isolating itself in its own black domain. The windows that formerly periodically exhibited candlelight now remained dark day and night, save for that greenish light that continued to leak from the third floor. A merchant who risked to climb onto the property to collect an old debt returned, transformed. His eyes were wide as he gazed blankly at the horizon, unable to speak coherently. His hands trembled excessively, and he refused to explain what he had witnessed. Within a week, he abandoned his business and went to another state, leaving everything behind. Those who knew him well say he was never the same man again. The home started to display increasingly more unsettling features, while, on some evenings, a thick fog would develop right around the property, especially if there was no moon. The fog rising from the valleys was different. This one had a grayish hue and moved against the wind as if it had a will of its own. It coiled around the towers of the house, seeped through the holes in the windows, and seemed almost alive in the way it writhed and undulated. The few visitors who still traveled through the region during the day stated that the mansion looked different depending on the angle from which it was viewed. From various points, it seemed to have 3 stories. It seemed to have 4 or even 5, according to some. The towers shifted position. The windows emerged in locations where they shouldn't be. The building's physical structure seemed to defy both reality and the rules of architecture. Inside the estate, according to the last staffers who managed to escape before the total lockdown, the situation had grown terrible. The corridors seemed to expand out over the night, becoming 2 or 3 times longer than they should have been. Rooms arose where before there had only been solid walls, and that closed chamber on the 3rd level, with its blackwood door, began to display peculiar scars, deep scratches that erupted from the inside as if something was attempting to get out. The family patriarch was last spotted going around the estate's grounds after dusk. He moved weirdly, with rigid mechanical steps, like a marionette being commanded by invisible strings. His head was inclined, at an odd angle, and he seemed to be chatting with something no one else could see. His hands moved in the air, sketching complicated designs that left glittering trails for a brief second before fading. The woman was no longer visible, not even for a quick glance, yet her presence could be felt. A sense of being watched permeated the entire property, and even the adjacent surroundings. Those who wandered too close to the boundaries of the Blackwood land experienced a tightness in their chest, as if invisible hands were tightening their lungs. Only when they swiftly went away did the feeling go away. There were rumors going around concerning the family's actual origins. Some thought they weren't truly a family, but something that had taken on human form. Others muttered that the true issue was the home itself, which had been constructed according to blueprints of unknown origin, with angles and dimensions that weren't appropriate for the natural environment. There were many who claimed that the ground where the mansion stood had been. Avoided by native peoples for generations, believed a spot where the veil between realms was dangerously thin. The municipal library, tiny but well kept, held historical records that identified that rocky elevation. The scriptures were unclear and often contradictory, but they all agreed on one thing: that was not a place to be inhabited. The references were obscure, full of analogies about doors that should not be opened and knowledge that should not be sought. But no one has paid much attention to these warnings. Until now. Winter was approaching, bringing with it chilly winds falling from the mountains. But around Blackwood House the temperature felt warped. Snow fell in the valley below, but on the property the air stayed oddly warm, almost feverish. The foliage around the home began to wither strangely, not with the typical dormancy of winter, but with an accelerated decomposition that converted green leaves into black dust in a matter of hours. The evenings became longer in that location, or at least that was the impression everyone had. The sun seemed to set earlier when they gazed towards the house. The darkness that poured upon the property was deeper, more total than a usual night, and lights started to emerge from that blackness. They weren't candlelight or lamplight. They were bright spots that drifted through the atmosphere in intricate geometric patterns, perhaps carving something imperceptible into the very fabric of reality. The silent horror that the Blackwood house had always inspired had turned into something more visceral. It was no longer merely fear of the unknown. It was the developing confidence that something was occurring in that area, something that exceeded human comprehension, and worst of all was the feeling that whatever this event was, it was only just beginning. The house watched, waited, and was getting ready to do something that would alter that peaceful area of Tennessee forever. As the days progressed into weeks, Blackwood House seemed to take on a life of its own in increasingly alarming ways. This mansion was no longer merely a silent structure atop the hill. It had become something that breathed, that pulsed, that existed in a state between the physical and the impossible. Reflections that did not match reality started to appear in the house's mirrors. An employee who had stayed longer than the others, driven by a strong desire for money, recalled how as he passed a mirror in the main hallway, he observed his reflection remain stationary while he continued going. The reflection examined him with a smile. He had never shone before, waved slowly, and then vanished into a black mist that appeared to eat away at the glass from the inside. The paintings that covered the walls of the home also began to shift. Portraits of ancestors who probably never lived depicted figures whose emotions altered when no one was gazing straight at them. A painting of a pastoral area gradually turned into a nocturnal scene where vague shadows wandered amid gnarled trees. Visitors who had been to the house months earlier and returned swore that the paintings were completely different, yet no one had replaced them. The yard surrounding the property had become an even more terrible area. Plants grew in odd directions, bending and interweaving in ways that defied Bodhi. Black flowers bloomed from the stony earth, releasing a sweetish aroma that produced dizziness and weird visions in anybody who inhaled it. The stone statues placed across the ground seemed to move position when no one was paying attention, steadily approaching the house, as if lured to something inside. The actual structure of the mansion began to reveal increasingly visible architectural impossibilities. Stairs that went up seemed to actually go down. Doors going to the exterior opened into various internal spaces. On the second floor, a particular hallway created a perfect circle. But when walking it completely, one found oneself on a new floor, sometimes in the basement, other times in the attic. The house's geometry was no longer Euclidean, with dimensions that. Processing was beyond the capabilities of the human mind. The sounds within the Blackwood mansion formed a symphony of the impossible. Footsteps sounded in vacant rooms. From the walls came whispers in unidentified tongues. There was music coming from nowhere. Melodies played on instruments that didn't exist, harmonies that made the ears bleed if anyone listened for too long, and beneath it all, a continual hum, so deep it was felt more in the bones than heard, as if the house itself were humming to itself. The Blackwood family had become nearly mythical in their solitude. No one saw them anymore, but their presence was clear. Shadows moved behind the thick curtains. The windows on the third story showed silhouettes. Tall, slim figures that didn't move as people should. A woman was reportedly seen walking the upper hallways, leaving trails of ice that dissolved into greenish vapor as her black dress trailed on the floor. The locked room on the third floor had become the epicenter of all the craziness. The light, leaking from under the door, now pulsed in a regular rhythm, like a heartbeat. The wood of the door was beginning to deteriorate, not with regular decay, but with a corruption that seemed alive. Luminescent fungi developed in geometric patterns on the surface, generating symbols that hurt the eyes when examined directly. During certain evenings, especially those without stars, the entire house seemed to vibrate. It wasn't a physical tremor, but something deeper, as if the reality surrounding the structure were fluctuating between states of existence. People in the valley below claimed to have seen the mansion at that time as if through murky water, with windows proliferating and then merging back into solid walls, towers appearing and vanishing, and its shape changing and warping. People in the city started experiencing collective nightmares, dreams in which they were chased by something they could never fully see and wandered through endless hallways. They would wake up with the sense of chilly hands stroking their faces, of voices chanting their names in tones no human throat could deliver. Some began painting the same symbols that showed on the locked bedroom door, without ever having seen that door in person. A trader, passing through the region, uninformed of the house's terrible reputation, opted to take shelter during a storm. He climbed the hill in severe rain and banged on the big front door. The door opened by itself, creaking on hinges that should no longer work. Calling for someone, anyone, he came in. His voice echoed, strangely multiplying and returning, twisted, as if many versions of himself were answering from different parts in the house. The merchant was never seen again after entering the door, but in the following days, folks traveling by the property swear they heard cries emanating from inside. Screams that seemed to originate from very far away, as if the individual were plunging down an endless well. Then the screaming would suddenly stop, and laughing would take their place, Not human laughing, but something that approximated the sound of joy, in a skewed and inaccurate way. Blackwood House had become more than just a haunted residence. It was now a focal point for energies that didn't belong to the natural world. A place where the laws of physics and reason were simply suggestions that might be twisted or altogether ignored. And most scary was the developing impression that the house was aware, that it was watching, that it was learning, and that it had intentions that reached well beyond its walls of stone and rotting wood. The winds sweeping from the hills carried, with them, an odor that couldn't be accurately described. It wasn't rot, it wasn't chemicals, it wasn't anything that had a name. It was simply wrong. A fragrance that shouldn't exist that made individuals feel queasy, not in their stomachs, but on a deeper level, as if their souls were rejecting that sensory input. And as the winter of 1879 intensified, bringing snow and ice to Tennessee, the Blackwood House remained an open wound in reality, a place where the impossible had become routine, where there was an irreversible blurring of the lines between what could and could not be. Blackwood House continued to change in ways that defied logic. What had once been just a curious mansion had become something entirely out of the ordinary, a place where reality itself seemed to function under different principles. The clocks inside the home began to behave chaotically. Some ran backward, others turned their gears at unimaginable speeds, and there were those that simply stopped. Yet their pendulums never lost velocity and kept swinging indefinitely. Time inside the house did not flow in the same manner as in the outer world. Visitors who stayed for only a few minutes emerged convinced that hours had passed, while others believed that entire days had been compressed into scant seconds. Blackwood House's shadows had taken on a distinct personality. They stopped following light sources as they ought to do. Shadows could be created in a room by a burning candle in the middle. That all pointed in the same direction, fully ignoring the flame's position. Worse, the shadows began to move independently of the objects that formed them. A figure walking would leave its shadow behind, and the dark shape would remain on the wall, watching before slowly drifting away to another spot. The mansion's attic had become a particularly uncomfortable location, yet from the outside, the house had a distinctive roof that limited the top room. Individuals that ascended the stairs discovered an attic that covered a lot more space than it should have. The ceiling receded into the blackness above, so high that not even the most powerful candles could illuminate it completely, and in that inconceivable vastness, things moved, shapes that lacked solid consistency, that seemed formed of mist and solidified darkness. Volumes with shifting contents were kept in the home library. An open book would display perfectly legible English writing. Closing and reopening it would reveal words in a language no one acknowledged, symbols that changed and twisted while being seen. Some pages were blank, but the surrounding surfaces showed shadows of text that didn't exist. When no one was reading, other volumes whispered stories that no human should know in muted whispers. The basement had become a continually moving labyrinth. Stretching in all directions, stone passageways opened into chambers that shouldn't be beneath a mansion that big, while others ended in solid walls. There were rooms packed with black. Water that reflected not the ceiling above, but starry sky of unknown constellations. Other chambers had simply emptiness, a void so complete that looking inside created dizziness and the sensation of plummeting upwards. Blackwood's wife began appearing in areas she shouldn't physically be able to reach. Villagers in the valley observed her standing atop the mansion's tallest tower, her black dress billowing in a breeze that wasn't blowing. But at the same time, her figure was glimpsed, in the first-floor windows standing totally still. And there were tales of her appearance in the garden, floating a few inches above the ground. Her head inclined at an angle that suggested she was studying something invisible to the naked sight. The patriarch was no longer visible at all, yet his impact remained obvious. Objects moved on their own within the house, rearranging themselves in specified patterns. Books were placed in perilous structures that defied gravity. Furniture was dragged around at night, creating concentric circles in the major rooms, and always, there was the impression that someone was directly behind you, watching with eyes that burned into the back of any invader. The doors of the Blackwood home gained a will of their own. Some refused to open no matter how much force was used, only to swing open moments later. Others led to various areas each time they were passed through. The pantry door might open to the library on one attempt and to the attic on the next. There wasn't consistency, no obvious reasoning. The interior of the house was continually altered, as though trying out various setups. Mirrors multiplied mysteriously. Suddenly, surfaces that had been solid walls began to reflect like shiny glass. Outward-facing windows revealed the interior of other rooms rather than the surrounding environment, producing absurd visual loops where one might see oneself from angles that made no sense in space, and there was always something more, an extra presence that had no source in the actual world. The temperature within the mansion became incredibly unstable. One room might be frigid enough to create ice on surfaces, while the neighboring room was stiflingly hot, the air rippling with heat, and these areas continuously shifted, pockets of severe cold appearing out of nowhere, followed by waves of heat that made the skin quiver. There was no evident source for these swings. The vibe of the mansion seemed to be at odds with itself. The sounds of the house developed into something much more unsettling. Voices conversed in languages dead for centuries. Laughter echoed without obvious origin, followed by silences so profound they made the ears ring. There was music, always that impossible music, played in harmonies that made the head hurt attempting to absorb them. Beneath it all, the steady hum had become more intense, joined by rhythmic beats that appeared to come from the structure's very foundations. The closed room on the third floor had become the pulsing heart of the entire abnormality. Now the door streamed a brightness so bright that it hurt to look at it. The wood was totally covered with those glowing mushrooms, forming increasingly complicated patterns, and from within came a new sound, something that could be characterized as singing. But it wasn't created by human voice cords. It was a frequency that resonated in the bones, that made the teeth vibrate, that planted unsettling pictures directly in the head of whoever heard it. During the darkest evenings, when not even the stars seemed inclined to enlighten that place, the Blackwood house shined, not with natural light, but with its own luminosity originating from the stones and wood. Like blood flowing through veins, waves of greenish and bluish light surged through the walls of the entire structure. And the house appeared considerably bigger on those nights. Towers that didn't exist during the day rose against the night sky. Windows multiplied by the thousands, and the house assumed size that might contain a full metropolis within its inconceivable interior. Blackwood House was no longer merely a location. It had become an entity, a consciousness that existed between worlds, touching realities that shouldn't intersect. And everybody who approached could feel its attention shifting to them, analyzing them, evaluating them, choosing whether they were worthy of entering or whether they should be kept away from the secrets that simmered in its vast depths. The weeks went on, and the influence of Blackwood House began to stretch beyond its gates. What had once been contained within that secluded hilltop home began to leak into the surrounding world like ink slowly spreading across absorbent paper. The forests around the mansion have become unnatural. The trees grew in spirals, their trunks curling upon themselves in fascinating patterns. Branches entwined, making arches and tunnels, creating corridors that seemed to beckon travelers to lose themselves in their depths. The bark of the trees formed patterns that resembled faces in torment, mouths wide in mute screams, hollow eyes that followed every movement. The fog that had previously only appeared around the house began to descend the hill during moonless nights. It flowed purposefully, snaking over the paths like a living creature, brushing the doors of the nearby houses, leaving damp stains that never completely dried. The fog had texture, according to many who woke up and saw it pressing against their windows. It pulsed and rippled as if it were breathing outside. The animals in the region evolved increasingly unusual behaviors. Horses ran in circles until they were so tired that they passed out. Dogs howled in unison for hours, all facing the same direction, always pointing towards the top of the hill. Birds fell dead from the sky for no apparent reason, their bodies forming perfect geometric patterns on the ground, and the coyotes, who normally avoided human proximity, began to gather on the edges of the Blackwood property, observing the house in silence while sitting in perfect circles. The town in the valley began to experience its own anomalies. Clocks throughout the region stopped precisely at midnight, all simultaneously, only to restart 3 minutes later. Mirrors in houses showed delayed reflections, movements that occurred seconds after the actual actions. Even when no one touched them, doors would creak on their own. Additionally, the sounds of footsteps reverberated through the deserted streets at night, giving the impression that unseen crowds were moving silently. March. People began having shared experiences they couldn't explain. Multiple residents reported seeing the same figure standing at the main intersection at dawn, a tall, slender silhouette that vanished when someone blinked. Others described waking up paralyzed, unable to move while sensing presences in their rooms, shapes that bent over their beds, examining them with inhuman interest before fading into the daylight. A blacksmith, a man of strong build and practical mind, decided that enough was enough. He forged an iron cross, convinced that it would offer protection against whatever was happening. However, the metal melted in his hands without generating any heat when he attempted to hang it on his workshop door. The iron merely changed into a black liquid that formed symbols on the floor and dripped between his fingers before dissipating into greenish smoke. There was a discernible lengthening of the nights. The sun seemed reluctant to rise, remaining below the horizon for periods that did not correspond to the seasons. And when it finally appeared, its light had a pale and sickly quality, as if shining through a veil that should not exist. The shadows that this light created were darker than normal, so black that they seemed like cutouts in reality itself. Inside the Blackwood house, the transformations reached new levels of impossibility. The rooms began to exist in multiple versions simultaneously. One might enter the dining room and find it perfectly tidy with silverware gleaming on the table. Exiting and re-entering would reveal the same room completely abandoned, covered in layers of dust, suggesting decades of neglect. And a third entrance might show the room completely empty, devoid even of furniture, just bare walls and a disturbing echo. The mansion's staircases developed properties that completely violated the laws of physics. One could reach the basement by going up 3 flights. One would end up in the attic if they descended. There were staircases that formed impossible circles, always going up but never reaching anywhere, or always going down, without ever coming to an end. Some simply ended in nothingness, steps that projected into the void, where stepping would mean falling, not to the ground below, but into a vacuum that seemed to extend infinitely. The kitchen had turned into a particularly eerie space. Food left on the tables didn't rot in the normal way. Instead, it crystallized into perfect geometric structures, or transformed into nameless substances, colors that didn't exist in the normal visible spectrum. Knives and cutlery floated a few centimeters above the surfaces, slowly rotating in orbital patterns, and there was always the smell of something cooking, even though no stove was lit. There was no discernible pattern to the scent, which fluctuated between being delicious and completely disgusting. The property's surrounding garden had undergone a total makeover. Black flowers now covered the entire area, but they were no longer flowers in the traditional sense. They were breathing, pulsating living things with open and closed petals. Synchrony, as though they were one enormous organism. Their roots had broken through the surface in many places, forming arches and bridges that connected different parts of the garden, creating a complex web of plant matter that seemed to have architectural purposes. The statues in the garden were no longer merely statues. Their positions visibly shifted now. No one needed to turn their backs. Stone limbs slid millimeters at a time, but they were always moving with glacial slowness. Some had begun to crumble, revealing not solid stone inside, but voids containing writhing, pulsating things. Severe vertigo and a feeling of being drawn inside were brought on by staring too long into these openings. The sky above Blackwood House began to exhibit its own phenomena. Clouds formed only over the property, clouds that swirled in perfect spiral patterns. From that particular angle, stars were visible during the day, constellations that no one recognized, forming patterns that made one's eyes water as one tried to follow them, and, at night, auroras of impossible colors danced above the house, even though it was so far south that such a phenomenon should never occur naturally. The feeling of being watched intensified dramatically. It was no longer just a vague impression. It was an overwhelming certainty that was completely oppressive. Every move made by anyone approaching the property was tracked by invisible eyes, and gradually people began to realize that they were not just being watched. They were being examined under a microscope like specimens by. Something that was determined to learn, even though it didn't fully comprehend what it was seeing. Blackwood House had become a focal point for energies that did not belong to the natural world. A place where the barriers between the possible and the impossible had become so thin that they were beginning to tear. And through these tears, things were beginning to leak out. Not things that could be named or understood, but presences, influences, forces that existed beyond human comprehension, and that now found a portal to a world that should never have known them. The winter of 1879 brought with it an even more profound transformation to Blackwood House and its surroundings. The snow that fell on the region had strange properties, crystals that shone with their own light even in total darkness, and when they melted, they left stains on the ground that remained cold to the touch for days. The mansion now existed in multiple states simultaneously. Observers stationed at different points around the property saw completely distinct versions of the structure. From one angle, it appeared to be in perfect condition, its walls immaculate and windows gleaming. From another, the house appeared in ruins, walls crumbling and the roof partially collapsed. And from a third vantage point, the mansion seemed not to be fully present, its form trembling and becoming translucent, revealing impossible landscapes through its semi-transparent walls. The residents of the region began to realize that their memories were being affected. People remembered events that never happened, conversations they never had, faces of individuals that no one else recognized. One merchant insisted that there was a second church in the city, describing it in perfect detail, although such a building had never existed. Others swore they had participated in festivals and gatherings that were not recorded anywhere. Ghosts of events that perhaps belonged to other versions of reality. The boundaries between dream and wakefulness became indistinct. People awoke from nightmares only to discover they were still dreaming. Layers upon layers of false. consciousness that needed to be traversed before reaching true wakefulness, and even then, they couldn't be sure. Reality had acquired a dreamlike quality, where objects subtly shifted when no one was looking, and conversations were forgotten the moment they ended. Inside the Blackwood house, the rooms began to multiply in an impossibly large way. Once ending at walls, corridors now stretched indefinitely for lengths that were impossible to fit inside the actual structure of the house. There were rooms inside rooms, doors that led to larger versions of the same area, and an infinite number of architectural recursions that were difficult to understand. The mansion's main hall had developed a particularly unsettling feature. The ceiling had turned transparent, but the sky above was hidden. Rather, it unveiled unthinkable oceanic depths where glowing beings swam in mesmerizing patterns. Sometimes these creatures pressed themselves against the invisible surface, their lidless eyes watching. Anyone in the hall below, and occasionally the barrier seemed so thin that water would begin to drip, though the drops would evaporate before touching the floor. The house's furniture had developed a life of its own in even more pronounced ways. Chairs rearranged themselves in perfect circles during the night. Tables rotated slowly as though they were circling something invisible, floating inches off the ground. A cacophony of wooden sounds reverberated throughout the room as cabinets opened and closed their doors in rhythmic sequences. Empty mansion, and there was a constant sense that these motions had a meaning, that they followed a pattern that just needed to be figured out. Blackwood's wife now appeared in multiple places simultaneously. She could be seen floating in the upper hallways, while her figure was also visible through the ground floor windows. Her multiple manifestations didn't seem aware of each other, each following its own route through the house, sometimes passing one another without recognizing it. And when she spoke, their voices overlapped, creating impossible harmonies that seemed to come from all directions at once. The locked room on the third floor had become the absolute epicenter of the entire anomaly. The door was no longer solid, oscillating between states of matter. Sometimes it was wood, other times it seemed made of solidified light, and at certain moments it became completely translucent, revealing glimpses of an interior that defied description. Impossible geometric shapes swirled in the air, objects that existed in more dimensions than the human eye could process, causing severe headaches to anyone who looked for too long. The city in the valley was being slowly transformed by the influence of the house. Small architectural impossibilities started to appear in buildings. A door that should have led to the street opened into the interior of another building on the other side of the square. Stairs that climbed to second floors inexplicably led to basement. Windows displayed reflections of locations that had vanished, or that had never existed. People developed strange habits without realizing it. They walked in specific patterns through the streets, tracing invisible symbols with their daily movements. They conversed in fragments of languages they didn't know, words that escaped their mouths without conscious intention, and at night many found themselves standing by their windows, staring intently at the hill where Blackwood House gleamed with its ghostly light, with no memory of how they had arrived there. The things that shouldn't be possible started to appear in city mirrors. The streets were filled with reflections of people who had passed away decades ago. In the specular worlds, buildings that had been demolished reappeared, and occasionally the reflections turned to face the observer and grinned in ways that weren't quite human. The water from the wells began to have strange properties. It reflected not the sky above, but starry skies of unknown constellations. Drinking from it caused vivid dreams that seemed more real than reality itself. Visions of locations with unattainable geometries, cities built at angles that hurt the eyes, inhabited by beings that moved in ways that did not obey the natural laws of motion. The church bell, which used to ring on a regular basis to indicate the hours, was no longer ringing. Instead, it rang at random times. Its chimes echoed with tones that seemed to contain multiple notes simultaneously, harmonies that caused strange physical sensations in those who heard them. Some people felt inexplicable joy, others fell into deep melancholy, and some simply stopped moving, frozen in place until the sound ceased. The very quality of daylight had changed. Even under a clear sky, the illumination had a slightly greenish hue, as if filtering through invisible colored glass. Shadows were darker and longer than they should have been given the angle of the sun. And during twilight, nameless colors appeared in the sky, hues that existed between red and purple, but were neither causing the eyes to water when trying to focus on them. Domestic animals began to act as if they saw things that humans couldn't perceive. Cats would fix their gazes on empty corners for hours, their pupils dilated and bodies tense. Dogs would rub against the empty air, fur bristling, retreating from unseen threats, and the few birds that still remained in the region built nests in perfect geometric patterns, structures that seemed more mathematical than natural. The Blackwood house continued its impossibly large growth. Towers that didn't exist in the morning rose by nightfall. The mansion's entire wings came and went. The structure appears to be experimenting with various configurations as it continuously rearranges itself. And through it all, there was that oppressive sense of awareness, of purpose, of something vast and incomprehensible, operating according to plans that encompassed far more than the simple physical existence of a house atop a hill in Tennessee. As winter deepened, Blackwood House and the region around it became a place where the very nature of existence seemed to be being rewritten. What had started out as isolated anomalies had evolved into an entire alternate reality that coexisted with the everyday world in increasingly obvious ways. The stars in the night sky above the property started to move with purpose rather than the slow, predictable motion of celestial spheres. They traced patterns in the firmament, connecting in lines of light that formed complex geometries. Entire constellations rearranged themselves night after night, as if the cosmos itself were trying to communicate something through its luminous dance. The moon, when visible above Blackwood House, did not correspond to the phase it should have been in elsewhere in the sky. It might be waxing over the town in the valley while appearing full over the mansion, and its light, as it bathed the property, had a thick, almost liquid silvery quality that seemed to trickle down the walls and pool in glistening puddles in the garden that never evaporated. Inside the mansion, the library's books had become miniature, portals to other places. Opening certain volumes revealed not pages but three-dimensional windows to impossible landscapes. Crystal cities that stretched vertically for miles, oceans that flowed upwards instead of horizontally, forests where trees grew in all directions simultaneously, their roots and canopies indistinguishable from one another. The paintings on the walls not only changed their images, but now allowed passage. People who touched certain paintings felt their hands sink into the surface as if it were water, and some swore they had seen landscapes stretching into the frames, corridors leading to places that could not exist within the physical walls of the house. No one was brave enough to try to cross completely, but the temptation was always present, a constant whisper inviting you to take just one more step. Time within the Blackwood house had become completely nonlinear. Events happened out of sequence. One might see a vase fall and shatter on the floor, and moments later the vase would be intact on the table, only to fall again, in an endless, repeating cycle. Conversations echoed from future moments, words being heard before they were spoken, and there were rooms where the past, present, and future seemed to exist simultaneously, superimposed in transparent layers that mixed and separated. The Blackwood family had become something completely otherworldly. The patriarch, when rarely seen, no longer seemed to have a consistent form. His silhouette oscillated between different configurations, sometimes appearing abnormally tall, other times compact, and occasionally seeming to exist in multiple spatial positions at the same time. His presence left visible traces of energy in the air, luminous trails that remained for minutes after he had passed. The wife had multiplied to such an extent that her manifestations filled the house. Dozens, perhaps hundreds of versions of her wandered the corridors, each slightly different from the others, as if they were variations on a theme. Some were translucent, others solid as marble, and there were those that seemed made of colored smoke that maintained human form by sheer force of will. They all moved in perfect synchronicity, as if they were fingers of the same hand, performing a complex choreography. The garden surrounding the house had become a completely alien ecosystem. The black plants now grew in fractal structures, each leaf a smaller replica of the entire plant, and each cell of those leaves containing even smaller versions, in a recursion that extended beyond the capacity of human vision. They emitted harmonic sounds when the wind blew, tones that combined into music that seemed ancient beyond comprehension, melodies that carried meanings that human language could not express. Creatures began appearing on the property grounds. They weren't animals anyone would recognize. They were forms that defied classification, beings that existed in intermediate states between solid and gas, changing appearance when viewed from different angles. Some had multiple limbs that bent in impossible directions. Others seemed to be made entirely of light, trapped in translucent membranes, and all of them observed the house with something that could be curiosity or perhaps reverence. The city and the valley had developed its own layer of unreality. Streets that everyone had always known suddenly led to different places. The central square could be reached by 7 different paths in the morning, but only 3 at nightfall. Houses changed position during the night, their occupants waking up at different addresses without the physical. Buildings having moved, people began exhibiting strange abilities. Some could hear whispering thoughts that weren't their own. Others saw overlapping layers of reality, multiple versions of the same scene unfolding simultaneously. There were those who discovered they could touch objects and feel their complete history flowing through them. Memories of everything that object had witnessed unfolding in their minds like books being turned quickly. The collective dreams intensified. Now they were not just shared nightmares, but complete dream experiences where multiple people inhabited the same dream space. They met in impossible landscapes, cities that existed only during sleep. And there they talked, explored, and learned things they couldn't articulate upon waking. And always, these dream landscapes included a version of Blackwood House, larger and more elaborate than its physical counterpart. The locked room on the 3rd floor had completely transcended physical reality. The door now existed in multiple dimensions, at the same time. Looking at it from the front showed solid wood. A step to the side revealed that it was made of crystallized light. Another angle showed that the door was actually an opening to absolute emptiness. And from all these states emanated an energy that could be felt throughout the property, a rhythmic pulse that seemed synchronized with some cosmic heartbeat. Impossible sounds filled both the house and the city. There were moments of silence so profound that people could hear their own blood circulating in their veins, and then explosions of cacophony. All the frequencies of the sound spectrum playing simultaneously, creating a symphony that was both painful and transcendent. Within this chaotic music, patterns could be discerned, rhythms that seemed to carry information. As if reality itself were trying to communicate through sound, The light emanating from Blackwood House at night had intensified to the point of being visible for miles. It was no longer just a greenish glow. It was a kaleidoscope of nameless colors, hues that existed outside the normal visible spectrum, but could somehow be perceived. This light cast shadows in impossible directions, creating areas of absolute darkness alongside regions of blinding brightness, with no gradation between the extremes. Gravity itself seemed to work differently near the mansion. Objects would occasionally float, hovering in the air for minutes before suddenly falling. Water from fountains flowed upwards, defying all logic. Additionally, there were areas in the garden where stepping gave the impression that you were walking on. Walls, spatial orientation shifting 90 degrees without warning, making the ground seem vertical and the walls seem horizontal. Blackwood House had become more than an anomaly. It was now a focal point where multiple realities met and merged, a place where the laws governing existence were merely suggestions that could be ignored. And through it all, that vast and incomprehensible consciousness persisted, something that observed, learned, and prepared for something yet to come. The depths of winter brought with them a transformation that no one could have foreseen. Blackwood House was no longer just a point of anomalies, but had become something much greater, something that transcended the very notion of a physical place. The mansion started to grow in ways that were wholly inconsistent with Euclidean geometry. Its interior became infinitely larger than its exterior. One could walk for hours through its corridors without ever reaching an exterior wall, passing through thousands of rooms that could not possibly fit inside the structure as seen from the outside. And each room was different from the last. Some decorated in styles from eras that had not yet arrived, others in styles from civilizations that never existed. The windows of the house now showed not the world outside, but views of other places, other times, perhaps entirely other universes. One window might reveal an endless ocean beneath 3 colorful moons. Another depicted a city made of silvery metal, with geometric shapes floating in place of people. There were windows that provided views of the stars' interiors. Some merely displayed emptiness, a darkness so total that it absorbed the light surrounding the frames, while others displayed flaming plasma dancing in mesmerizing patterns. The inhabitants of the town in the valley discovered that they could occasionally glimpse these other worlds even without being in the house. Reflections in puddles briefly showed alien landscapes. Impossible architectural designs were hinted at by shadows on the walls, and during twilight, when the light was just right, the very air seemed to become translucent, revealing layers of other realities superimposed on their own. Interpersonal communication started to break down in peculiar ways. Words left mouths but reached ears in different orders, phrases becoming jumbled in the air between speaker and listener. Some conversations happened simultaneously in multiple languages, each person hearing the language they understood best, even though everyone was speaking something different. And there were moments when thoughts were transmitted directly without the need for words, pure understanding flowing from mind to mind. Inside the Blackwood house, the family had completely transcended any recognizable human form. The patriarch was no longer a physical figure, but rather a presence, a distortion in space that suggested form but lacked it. His influence could be felt as changes in air pressure, in temperature fluctuations, in ripples in the very fabric of reality. Everywhere he was, his impossible presence caused the world to bend to accommodate him. The wife had grown exponentially. Not just the house was filled with her manifestations, but began to appear in the city, in the woods, everywhere the mansion's influence touched. Every iteration of her was a distinct aspect, a singular manifestation of something far bigger than the sum of its parts. Together, they formed a pattern, a composite entity that existed simultaneously in thousands of locations, all connected by invisible threads of shared consciousness. The locked room on the third floor had ceased to exist as a defined physical space. Now it was a point of convergence, a place where all realities met. The door had completely disappeared, replaced by an opening without fixed edges, pulsating and breathing, expanding and contracting like a hole in existence itself. Through it, glimpses of infinity could be captured, visions that shattered the mind as one tried to comprehend them. The surrounding vegetation had developed into shapes that were unrelated to any known biology. Plants grew in impossible loops, their stems passing through each other without touching. Flowers bloomed in extra dimensions, petals stretching, in directions the eye could not follow. And they all sang, their collective voices creating harmonies that seemed to resonate with the fundamental frequencies of the universe. The creatures that inhabited the garden had increased in number and diversity. Beings of pure light walked alongside forms made of solidified darkness. Entities that existed partially outside of three-dimensional space left trails of impossibility wherever they went, and they all converged on the house, circling it in complex orbits like planets around a sun that did not illuminate but distorted space-time itself. Blackwood House had become a warped reflection of the town in the valley. Buildings began to exhibit the same impossible properties. Rooms that led to non-existent locations, and interiors that were larger than exteriors. And the people gradually were changing too, not physically, but in their perceptions, in their abilities, in their understanding of reality. They began to see things that were previously invisible, to hear frequencies that were, to think in ways that were previously unthinkable and previously unheard. Over the whole area, the sky turned into a spectacle of impossibilities. Clouds formed perfect fractal structures. Lightning created 90-degree angles in the air and struck in straight lines. Rainbows appeared at night, shining with colors that did not exist in normal light. And through it all, those dancing stars kept moving, tracing symbols that, if only someone could decipher them, seemed to hold deep meanings. Sound had become visual. People could see sound waves propagating through the air, see them ricocheting off surfaces, see them intertwining in complex interference patterns. Music left colorful trails in space, geometric shapes formed by voices hung in midair for a few seconds before vanishing. And silence had texture, a thick quality that could be felt pressing against the skin. Light, too, had acquired liquid properties. Beams of sunlight trickled down the walls like golden honey. Shadows flowed across the floor like dark water. And, where light and shadow met, they created eddies and currents, miniaturized oceans of light and darkness that never fully mixed, maintaining a defined boundary, even as they swirled around each other. The fabric of reality itself had become visible to those with eyes to see. It appeared as an incredibly complex tapestry, threads of energy interwoven in patterns so intricate that contemplating them for too long caused vertigo. And this tapestry was being rewritten, threads being pulled and repositioned, the pattern being altered. By forces operating from within the Blackwood house, people began to experience moments of temporal displacement. They would step into a room and emerge decades into the future or the past, seeing different versions of themselves, encountering relatives who had not yet been born or who had long since passed away. These moments were brief flashes of other times before returning to their normal present. However, they created enduring memories of things that had not yet happened or would never happen. The collective. The region's consciousness was gradually coming together. Individual boundaries started to become hazy. Thoughts leaked from one mind to another. Dreams were shared by everyone in the population, not just a select few. And there were moments of absolute clarity where everyone felt exactly what everyone else felt. A momentary telepathic connection that revealed the true nature of human loneliness, and simultaneously the potential for something much greater. The Blackwood house pulsed at the center of it all, a heart beating not with blood, but with pure energy, pumping possibility through the veins of reality instead of life. It had become a portal, a passage, an anchor point for something too vast to be fully comprehended. And this something was getting closer and closer to fully manifesting itself, to crossing the threshold between the impossible and the real, to becoming part of the world in a way that would change everything forever. Everyone could sense the impending final transformation, like a constant pressure in the air, a tension that grew with each passing hour. Blackwood House had emerged as the focal point of a fundamental shift that was altering the essence of life in the area. The mansion was now in several stages of its own history and future at the same time. One looking at it could see overlapping versions of the structure, all occupying the same space but in different states of being. There was the newly built house, its pristine walls and perfectly ordered gardens. There was the current version, warped by altered reality and pulsing with unattainable energy. And there were visions of potential futures, some showing the house in magnificent ruins, others revealing it transformed into something completely alien, a structure of crystal and light that barely bore any resemblance to its original form. The mansion's hallways had transformed into multi-dimensional mazes of unfathomable intricacy. One could walk backward in time by taking a step forward. Turning right resulted in upward movement through layers of reality. Doors opened not to adjacent rooms but to locations separated by continents or eras. And through it all, the architecture maintained its own logic, an organizational system that made perfect sense to the consciousness inhabiting the house, but remained eternally enigmatic to human minds. The walls of the Blackwood house had become membranes between worlds. From some perspectives, they revealed landscapes from other planes because they were translucent, of existence. Through them, inverted cities could be seen floating in earthly skies. Oceans of liquid fire glowed with their own light. Forests of singing metal stretched to impossible horizons. And creatures, so many creatures, beings of forms and natures that defied categorization, moved through these alien landscapes, occasionally pressing against the membranes as if trying to comprehend what they saw on the other side. The mansion ceiling had completely disappeared, replaced by a direct view of the cosmos that was not the known cosmos. Galaxies whirled in spirals of hues not found in the standard spectrum. As if the universe itself were attempting to communicate through its celestial structures, nebulae formed identifiable faces and figures, and stars fell upward, launching themselves from the floor of the house towards the boundless heavens, tracing arcs of light that left permanent trails in the air. The Blackwood family had completely transcended any form of individual existence. The father was no longer a single thing, but had evolved into a cloud of probabilities and a field of possibilities that appeared differently to each observer. He was seen by some as a majestic figure of authority, by others as a walking vacuum that absorbed the light around him, and by still others as merely an emotion, a burden on their conscience, and a presence that occupied mental rather than physical space. The wife had fragmented into so many instances that she was now omnipresent. Every corner of the house, every shadow, there was a version of her in every reflection. They moved in perfect synchronicity, thousands of bodies performing the same dance, thousands of voices singing the same impossible melody. Together, they formed a larger organism, a distributed consciousness that experienced the world through countless simultaneous perspectives. And when all these voices spoke in unison, the very air vibrated with power, words that were not merely sound, but altered reality as they were uttered. The mansion's third floor was no longer at a physical level, and had evolved into a concept, a state of being that, if one knew how, could be accessed from anywhere in the house. A core of pure transformation now pulsed where the locked room had once stood. It was no longer a hole or a door, but something far more fundamental. It was a point where all possibilities converged, where every version of every event that could have occurred existed simultaneously. It pulsed to the beat of creation and served as the center of Blackwood House itself. The city in the valley had transformed into a distorted mirror of the mansion. Each building now displayed impossible properties in a more pronounced way. Once a straightforward, sturdy building, the church's interior now stretched endlessly upward, its ceiling vanishing into clouds that developed inside the structure. The tavern was in several states at once, full of spectral customers from various eras who drank and chatted without realizing one another. And the houses, each individual residents, had developed rooms that were not in their original plans. The spaces that appeared and disappeared, following rhythms that no one could predict. The inhabitants of the region were no longer entirely human in the traditional sense. Their awareness had grown, reaching previously unreachable levels of perception. They could see not only the present, but shadows of pasts and echoes of futures. Every individual exuded a sense of potential, translucent manifestations of themselves that demonstrated who they might have been in various situations. Additionally, these alternate versions engaged with each other, resulting in multi-layered dialogues where several realities overlapped. Communication evolved beyond language. Thoughts were transmitted as vivid images unfolding in the minds of those receiving them. Emotions flowed between people like streams of colored water, visible and palpable. And there were moments of complete unity where the entire population of the city became a single. Shared consciousness, viewing the world from hundreds of different angles at once, an orchestra of perceptions that produced a much deeper and more intricate understanding of reality than any one person could accomplish on their own. The woods surrounding the property had transformed into a forest of materialized dreams. Trees grew in ascending spirals that pierced the sky, their canopies disappearing into other dimensions. Their roots plunged deep not only into the earth, but through the very fabric of spacing, anchoring themselves in past and future moments. And among the trunks, creatures of pure imagination roamed freely. There were wolves made of silvery mist that dissolved and reformed with each step, deer with antlers that were actually miniaturized trees, entire ecosystems growing from their heads, and birds that sang in colors, their melodies painting the air with hues that remained visible for minutes after the sound ceased. The Blackwood house's garden had shrunk into a tiny universe. Each plant was now a portal to another realm. The black flowers opened not to show stamens and pistils, but to reveal entire landscapes contained within their petals. Galaxies swirled inside buds, oceans rippled in leaves. And those who dared to look closely found that they could project their consciousness into these micro-realities, discovering whole worlds that existed in areas smaller than a grain of sand. The local water had taken on characteristics that were incompatible with all accepted physics. Rivers flowed in multiple directions at the same time, their currents intertwining without ever mixing. Puddles reflected not the sky above, but skies of other worlds, and objects falling into them vanished, crossing over into the reflected realities, and the rain, when it fell, was no ordinary water. Each drop contained memories, fragments of experiences from lives never lived, and touching these drops transmitted those memories directly to consciousness, filling minds with stories of people who never existed, but who were as real as any. Memory of their own. The wind carried more than air. It whispered secrets from distant universes. It conveyed the feeling of flowers growing under alien suns on planets. It carried the sounds of music written by societies that existed in dimensions where time was reversed. And as it passed through Blackwood House, the wind briefly acquired consciousness, turning into a sentient being for a few seconds before fading back into a simple atmospheric current. The area was exposed to sunlight during the day, but longer came solely from the sun. Multiple sources of illumination existed simultaneously, each casting its own shadow, creating patterns of light and darkness so complex that they formed maps. And these shadows were alive, conscious, moving with their own intention. When there was no music, they danced. They formed figures and symbols that told stories without words. And occasionally they touched people, and this touch transmitted knowledge, sudden understandings of cosmic truths that language was incapable of expressing. The night brought its own wonders. Darkness was no longer the absence of light, but a presence of its own, a substance that could be felt and even molded. Craftspeople found that they could create structures and forms that only existed at night and vanished at dawn by shaping darkness like clay. And in that malleable darkness, the stars were not distant points of light, but windows to other places, portals that, if one knew how, could be crossed. The local fauna had changed along with the times. Cats moved between dimensions as if simply jumping from one piece of furniture to another. Dogs could sniff out trails through time, following the old-days actory trail of events that had occurred years before, or that would still occur years later. Birds flew not only through the air, but through the layers of reality, disappearing and reappearing in places that had no obvious spatial connection. And all of them, each creature, carried within itself a spark of the same energy that animated the Blackwood house. Collective dreams had become a complete alternate reality. People's consciousnesses blended together while they slept, creating a shared world that was just as complex and vibrant as the real world. They constructed imaginative cities there. They discovered truths about the nature of existence that were incomprehensible while awake, and they explored landscapes that changed in response to their collective mood. Some started to favor the dream world, living full lives in that alternate reality and sleeping more than they were awake. The Blackwood house pulsed at the center of all this transformation, a beacon of impossibility that called, attracted, seduced. Its influence now extended for miles, touching everything and everyone, rewriting the basic rules of how things could be. And within its infinite walls, within its corridors that stretched across dimensions, within its pulsating heart of pure possibility, something was awakening, something vast, something ancient, something that had waited through ages beyond count for the opportunity to fully manifest itself. And that manifestation was imminent. It was evident in the air's mounting tension, the stars' ever more intricate patterns in the sky, and the way reality itself seemed to be holding its breath. The Blackwood house was about to complete its transformation, and when it did, nothing in the region, perhaps nothing in the world, would ever be the same again. The transformation of the Blackwood house reached its culminating moment on a night when the sky seemed to contain every imaginable color and some. That ought not to exist. Light and shadow danced in perfect harmony as the mansion's intense light changed the night into a state that was neither day nor darkness. In that final moment, the house simply ceased to fight against its own impossible nature. The walls dissolved into luminous mist. The towers stretched infinitely upward, piercing not only the sky, but the very dimensional structure that separated one reality from another. And through these perforations, other worlds began to leak out, merging with Tennessee in 1879 in a fusion that created something entirely new. The Blackwood family, or what was left of the Blackwood family concept, had entirely blended into the spirit of the house. They were no longer inhabitants, but part of the very structure. Consciousnesses woven into the fabric of altered reality. Every hallway, every shadow, and every whisper of the wind that blew through the impossibly large spaces were all signs of their presence. The valley and the city changed into an extension of the mansion. The boundaries between one building and another became fluid. When people realized that they could pass through walls if they thought it was feasible, the distinction between inside and outside became meaningless because everything was both inside and outside at the same time, a part of a greater organism that encompassed the entire area. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the intensity diminished. Instead of going away, it found a new balance. The Blackwood house remained, but transformed into something that existed in multiple realities simultaneously. From some perspectives, it appeared to be nothing more than a deserted mansion perched atop a hill. Others saw it as a throbbing doorway to limitless worlds. And from still others, it wasn't there at all, just an empty space where memories of a house persisted. The people of the region learned to live in this new reality. They eventually stopped asking questions as they adjusted to the impossibilities that were now normal. Blackwood House had simply become part of their lives, a constant presence that reminded everyone that the world was far stranger and more wonderful than they had ever imagined. To this day, they say the house is still there, waiting atop that hill in Tennessee, shifting, observing, existing in states that defy description. A monument to the impossible. A reminder that reality is much more brittle and changeable than we would like to think. Additionally, if you ever find yourself in the Tennessee mountains on a deserted road, and you see on the horizon a house that seems to be in multiple places at once, that shines with colors you can't name, that calls to you with voices you feel in your bones instead of hearing with your ears, well, maybe it's best to keep going. Or perhaps not. The choice is always yours. This was the tale of Blackwood House, a journey through the strange and the amazing that serves as a reminder that there are more mysteries in the world than our own. It was a story of transformation, of impossibility made real, of limits being tested and broken. Minds can comprehend. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more narratives that explore the dark and mysterious side of imagination. Tell us what you think in a comment, then forward it to people who enjoy unusual stories.